The skies were strangely empty. For months, Japan had lived in fear of the American bombers that came each night. Cities burning, sirens wailing, families huddled underground. But now, over the coastal city of Kamaishi, no shadows passed overhead. Instead, the danger came from somewhere no one expected. Out beyond the ocean's haze, the shadows of giants moved across the water. Battleships, cruisers, a dozen American warships advancing in formation. For the first time in living memory, an entire fleet had come within sight of the Japanese mainland. The horizon erupted. Over 100 naval guns opened fire, hurling shells the size of cars into the coast. Blast waves shattered windows miles inland. Entire factory blocks split apart, flames rising where steel once stood. Panic rippled through the city, disbelief, and terror. And from one of the ships, a banner unfurled in the wind. Never forget Pearl Harbor. America's revenge was just getting started. In the summer of 1944, over 250,000 servicemen braved enemy fire as they stormed ashore across the beaches of Normandy during D-Day. Yet France wasn't the only front Americans were taking by storm. Halfway across the world, Japan felt the weight of this renewed pressure as U.S. vessels began to crack down on the absolute national defense zone. The first major strike came at the Marianas, where American submarines tore apart reinforcement convoys and Pacific Marines carried out their own amphibious assault across the island of Saipan, less than 1,600 miles from the Japanese mainland. It was an expensive victory for the Americans, with over 2,000 men cut down by Japanese artillery during the invasion. Yet the U.S. knew that every single island they could get a hold of brought them one step closer to victory. The next target was Iwo Jima, where around 30,000 Japanese soldiers turned volcanic rock into a fortress, erupting from tunnels and concealed bunkers to slaughter Marines from all directions the moment they stepped onto the shore. American planners predicted the island would fall in a week. Instead, the battle raged for over a month. By the time the island was finally secured, another 7,000 American lives had been lost. And still, the bloodshed was far from over, because before reaching Japan's mainland, the Americans would have to secure Okinawa, where the Japanese hurled over 100,000 attackers, including civilians and children, either convinced or forced into sacrificing themselves for the emperor. It was, by all accounts, one of the bloodiest campaigns the Americans had ever encountered. The invasion cost the Allies nearly 100,000 casualties. More than 380 vessels were damaged, and over 760 aircraft were lost. Civilian losses mirrored those of the soldiers. Reports suggested that over 100,000 Okinawans were claimed, many caught in crossfire, others taking their own lives, either while charging out at the Americans or sacrificing themselves out of fear. At times, the battle grew so brutal that American troops fired indiscriminately. One infantryman later confessed, quote, "There was some return fire from a few of the houses, but the others were probably occupied by civilians, and we didn't care." However, by the time the guns finally fell silent on Okinawa in June, the Allies had managed to do what had once seemed impossible: muscle their way to Japan's doorstep, close enough to have their bombers deliver some of their heaviest payloads right onto the streets of Tokyo. The U.S. had hoped this would be enough to force the Japanese into surrender, yet the Empire showed no sign of capitulation. With tens of thousands of Marines lost during the island-hopping campaign across the Pacific, the last thing America was to launch yet another amphibious invasion across the Japanese mainland, where losses would most certainly surpass the toll of the battles of the Marianas, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa combined. Still, the Allies had not gotten this far to turn back home at the last minute. Military leaders gathered in command rooms to discuss the best way to proceed. The Navy, tired of sending men to their graves, opened the conversation by suggesting a less drastic approach: to stage a naval blockade that would gradually extinguish the resistance that remained in Japan's mainland. To speed up the process, the U.S. would keep carrying out a relentless aerial bombardment campaign from carriers and aerial bases that had already been secured across the Pacific. Some planners even suggested postponing an amphibious invasion of Japan's mainland until as late as 1948, when hopefully the risk of casualties had been considerably reduced. However, the Army argued that soft approaches and delays were out of the question. Germany and Italy had already fallen. The war could not truly end until the Empire was broken. Thus, Operation Downfall was born, the plan for a direct invasion of Japan. It would come in 2 phases. Operation Olympic, scheduled for November 1945, aimed to seize Kyushu. Then, in early 1946, Operation Coronet would follow, commanding men into an assault on Tokyo Bay. Some estimated the potential casualties of the campaign as high as hundreds of thousands, possibly over 1 million. Still, the plan was approved. According to Japanese military ideology, every soldier bore the sacred duty of sacrificing their lives for the emperor before surrendering to an enemy. Americans had already gotten a taste of just how seriously the Japanese took this philosophy. As the Allies closed in on the Empire, Marines witnessed swarms of Japanese pilots from the Special Attack Corps take off and set course toward their fleets. Many of the men flying the aircraft had little training. Some didn't even know how to land a plane properly. It didn't matter. None of them were expected to return. Before reaching Japan, nearly 2,000 kamikaze attacks had already struck, hitting more than 150 American vessels and reducing some of the Navy's finest ships to flaming wrecks. The Americans had never witnessed a strategy like it, and the Japanese would exploit it to the limit. Operation Ketsuko, translated to Operation Decisive, called for the concentration of Japan's forces across strategic posts in the islands, ordered to stand against the Allies upon their arrival with whatever weapons they could get a hold of. Japan didn't expect to turn the war in their favor with these aggressive tactics, but they did hope that by threatening as many casualties as possible, the Allies had no option but to reach more favorable conditions than the ones Germany faced upon being taken. If the Americans were to proceed with Operation Downfall, they'd need to ensure that the damage caused by these initial Japanese counterstrikes was kept to a minimum. Luckily for the U.S. Navy, there was one key weakness in Japan's defenses that they could exploit before having to deploy a single Marine to the shore. Despite the nation's investment in its fleet and aerial forces, the Empire had not bothered to build a coastal artillery that could efficiently fend off incoming enemy fleets. There was little reason to believe they needed one. It had been nearly a century since Japan's shores had been under naval bombardment, and with a strong hold in the Pacific during the early years of the war, it seemed highly unlikely that the Empire would ever have to rely on guns in its ports for defense. But by 1945, Japan could no longer rely on its former glory, and if it couldn't fire back at incoming ships on the horizon, the Allies' naval cannons would pave the way for a smooth invasion, one shell at a time. During the initial phases of the Pacific Campaign, American carriers had spearheaded the battle, with battleships being primarily used to defend them against incoming attackers, rather than to carry out solo operations. However, with most of the region under Allied control, and carrier usage gradually on the decline, it was time for the U.S. battlecruisers to get their moment to shine. The plan was for the American fleet to get closer than it had ever gotten before to Japan's shore, starting with a series of naval bombardments across key targets on the coast, which would hamper the Empire's industrial capabilities. However, the true goal of the operation would be to force Japan to spend its last remaining defenses. Kamikaze pilots would take off by the hundreds and be cut down by the more capable American pilots. By the time American Marines disembarked onto the shore, there'd be little resistance left, and the U.S. would secure the mainland by just a fraction of the casualties it had anticipated. On paper, it was a promising idea, but before the U.S. Navy could begin to deploy vessels to the shore, commanders had to make sure there weren't any traps laid out for them in the waters ahead. And so, before the American warships arrived, the first vessels sent to reach Japan's shores were the U.S. Navy submarines USS Barb and USS Truda. Their initial assignment was simple enough: sweep the waters for mines and clear safe passage for the American fleets closing in on the home islands. However, it didn't take long before commanders and crew got a little too excited, deciding to test the waters ahead even further and see for themselves just how ready Japan truly was to fight back. Before sailing, Barb had been outfitted with an experimental 127mm rocket launcher, and her audacious skipper, Commander Gene Fluckey, had no intention of letting it gather dust. Using the night as cover, Barb crept silently toward the coastline of Hokkaido. Japan's coastal defenses were thin, yet the crew knew danger could still come from any direction. Every man aboard was tense, eyes darting to every angle, making sure they were not being followed. When the submarine closed within range of the town of Shari, Flucky gave the order. A volley of 12 rockets tore into the night, slamming into streets and buildings indiscriminately. The entire town was jolted awake by the thunder of explosions, yet by the time anyone could react, Barb was already gone, slipping back into the sea. She struck again soon after, surfacing off Cayo. Shells and rockets landed on just about everything Flucky and his men could target in the dim light. Infrastructure collapsed onto itself, and boats moored along the coast soon caught on fire. USS Trotta followed Barb's lead, conducting raids of her own across scattered coastal towns. It was far from being the worst strike America had dealt Japan during the war. In fact, the attacks carried virtually no tactical weight for the campaign. However, the submarine commanders were not aiming for a lethal hit. They were aiming to sow confusion and paranoia, and in that, they succeeded. The Japanese coastal defenders suddenly lost focus as they tried to guess where the next blow would fall. Defenses scattered, and morale plummeted as it became evident that any hope for an organized defense against a naval attack was off the table at this stage in the war. For American sailors who had fought tooth and nail for years against the Japanese, to witness their defenses crumbling was a delight. And for the crew on board the Barb, it was impossible to resist taking it one step further. Skirting past minefields and patrol craft, Commander Flucky took his submarine north toward Sakhalin. Peering through the periscope and seeing no opposition, he dared to come closer than he had before. As soon as the vessel surfaced, sailors boarded boats and rowed quietly toward shore. No army supported them. They were on their own, deep in enemy territory. Still, they never looked back. Their target lay ahead, a railroad line, impossible to reach from the sea. Working quickly, the men wired demolition charges to the tracks. Every sound threatened discovery, and every second felt like an eternity. Once the explosives were set, they raced back toward their boats, paddling hard for the submarine waiting offshore. They hadn't even climbed back aboard when they heard a massive explosion going off behind them. A train had hit the charges, shattering the track and erupting in a cloud of fire. The American message had been delivered. Now the Japanese knew no town, road, or railway in their homeland was safe. As USS Barb and Trotta worked their way up the coast, U.S. aircraft started to make passes across Japan's skies, scouting for potential targets the incoming warships could go for and testing the enemy's defense. For the first time, bombers were able to fly unchallenged over areas that had been unreachable throughout the war, and they made sure to make the most of it. While patrolling over Hokkaido, Honshu, and the outskirts of Tokyo, the bombers let their payloads fall, tearing into factories, rail lines, and ships. More than 30 Japanese vessels were lost in these first strikes. However, no aerial attacker came to meet them, and American pilots returned to their carriers without so much as a scratch on their fuselages. Japan no longer dared to send its interceptors to fight against the bombers, opting to instead save every last drop of fuel for the decisive battle they believed would detonate when the Allies launched their final invasion of the home islands. The U.S. needed the Empire to at least deploy some of their fighter reserves for the operation to be worth it, and if aerial bombardment alone would not do it, it was time to move to the next phase. By mid-July, it was deemed that enough progress had been made for American warships to move within range of Japan's shore, their turrets turning toward diverse coastal towns. The mission would fall to Task Unit 3481, a detachment of battleships, heavy cruisers, and destroyers from Task Force 38. They would be the first foreign Navy servicemen to unleash surface gunfire on Japan's shores since the Western powers had bombarded the nation's coastal defenses more than 80 years earlier during the Shimonoseki campaign. And when their guns went off, they'd make sure the world heard them. Time magazine reported after the attack took place, quote, "For 2 hours the guns roared, and their shell bursts walked through the steel plant. The Jap reply from shore batteries was only a whispered echo. The sacred soil of Japan, from which the kamikaze, or divine wind, was supposed to disperse all attackers, had been violated." Among the first targets of these initial bombardments was the vast ironworks at the city of Kamaishi. From nearly 29,000 yards offshore, shells ranging from 127 to 406 millimeters rained down. Though the ships could not go over the sections that were mined and were kept further from the shore than they'd initially planned, their salvos still found their mark in the ironworks ahead. The shockwaves were so strong they rippled across the entire city, shaking homes off their foundations and making more than one building collapse. Civilians dropped to their knees as glass shattered, pipes burst, and fires ignited across neighborhoods. The Americans had hoped such destruction might finally force the Japanese to commit some of their precious grounded aircraft, but Imperial commanders refused. By now, the Empire had little to lose, and it would take more than a single naval bombardment on one of its coastal towns to sacrifice its last defenders. From the harbor, a handful of Japanese naval servicemen standing on the hull of their submarine chaser looked at the attacker ahead, wondering if they ought to obey command and remain put, even as the city around them burned, or if they should set sail at once and deal one final strike against their enemies before going down. Before they even got a sense of where the shells were coming from, a direct hit landed on their vessel, sinking the ship and taking 28 men with her. By the end of the bombardment, nearly 1,500 homes were destroyed. Hundreds of civilians had lost their lives, and the ironworks, though at first thought to have survived, was later revealed to have been crippled, their production capacity shattered. In the days that followed, images of the devastation spread around the world, letting everyone know America had begun the systematic destruction of Japan, and it would not stop until the empire surrendered or was ground into ash. Upon the initial naval bombardment of Kamaishi, American battleships, light cruisers, and destroyers were ordered north to conduct another strike, this time on the coastal city of Muroran, on the island of Hokkaido. The objective was once again to lure out the Japanese defenses, while also crippling Japan's already fragile industry. This time, the target was the steel plants in that city that kept what remained of Japan's war machine alive. Sailors hoped for it to be yet another easy strike, but by the time ships reached the shoreline, visibility collapsed into a thick haze that cloaked the city from view. Sailing closer to confirm the targets was not an option, as the waters were likely seeded with mines that American submarines had not been able to remove. Still, the Americans refused to hold back. The battleships turned their guns toward the obscured coastline and opened fire, trusting their estimated bearings to deliver a critical hit upon the local industry. Around 860 16-inch shells flew toward Muroran, yet only 170 struck the steelworks. The rest landed short, overshot, or tore into the civilian neighborhoods beyond, reducing large sections of the city to rubble. Aboard USS Missouri, Admiral William Halsey kept his eyes fixed on the skies as the bombardment roared on. Operating this close to the homeland with such poor visibility left them near defenseless if the Japanese were to decide to finally unleash a wave of kamikaze attackers against them. According to Halsey, the 6 hours the fleet spent shelling Muroran were the longest of his life. Yet by the time the bombardment ceased, the feared counterstrike never came. It seemed that no matter how badly American fleets bombarded Japan's coast, the Empire would just not give the Allies what they wanted, refusing to surrender their last defenders, even as city upon city collapsed. The American fleet pressed on, raining shells by the hundreds on industrial targets that inevitably resulted in the leveling of the surrounding cities. Not every bombardment crippled factories as intended, yet the overall bombardment campaign succeeded in wrecking the already torn coastal towns of Japan. And by July 26th, after weeks of relentless strikes, the United States, joined by China and Great Britain, declared that the time had come for demanding Japan to surrender one last time. The Potsdam Declaration spelled out the Empire's only way forward: surrender unconditionally, or face, in their words, quote, prompt and utter destruction. Japan's cities lay in ruins. Its fleet had been sunk, its air power gutted, and even if they still had some reserves on the mainland to use during an upcoming amphibious invasion, collapse was all but certain. Still, Japan's response remained the same. The fight would go on. It was time for America to make one final decision: either formally commit to the land invasion of Japan or agree to negotiate with the enemy. Those seemed to be the only two options for a long time, until the successful test of the world's first atomic bomb turned Japan's worst fear into a reality. The US now had the strongest weapon in the world, and with it, they could wreck the nation without having to send a single man to the mainland. The first atomic bomb fell from the B-29 Enola Gay on August 6, 1945, over the city of Hiroshima. In an instant, it unleashed one of the most devastating attacks the world had ever witnessed, obliterating nearly 70% of the city's buildings and claiming the lives of up to 100,000 people. The damage inflicted by Allied naval bombardments, critical as it had been, paled in comparison to this single strike. Shortly afterward, President Truman issued a warning, quote, "If Japan does not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. Behind this air attack will follow sea and land forces in such numbers and power as they have not yet seen, and with the fighting skill of which they are already well aware." Yet Emperor Hirohito hesitated. Unless the Allies guaranteed that his throne would remain intact, the war must continue. In response, the United States unleashed a second atomic bomb just 3 days later, this time on Nagasaki, claiming the lives of another 80,000 people. As Japanese cities burned, the situation only grew worse as a new threat emerged from the north. More than 1.5 million Soviet soldiers stormed into Japanese-held Manchuria, overwhelming the Kwantung Army and tearing through what remained of Japan's defenses. Within days, the empire was surrounded and crippled. At last, Emperor Hirohito resolved to surrender. Japan had endured more than a year of relentless losses in the Pacific. Its fleet sunk, its islands seized, its cities shattered by firebombs and naval bombardments. But it was the atomic bomb that broke their will to fight. In his address to the nation, Hirohito confessed, quote, "The enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable. Should we continue to fight, not only would it result in the ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, but also it would lead to the total extinction of human civilization." On August 15th, 1945, Japan finally laid down its arms. World War II was over, ending one of the darkest chapters in human history and silencing the guns raining devastation on Japan's shores.